So welcome everybody. We'll give a minute or so for people to settle in. Of course, a lot of you are probably, most of you are probably coming from the Disney talk. How do you follow that with all those video clips from all the movies? I thought I'll put up a video of people assembling data centers, but that isn't as much fun. So we'll give it a few seconds, let the people settle in. Everybody got a copy of the book? I'm the author, in case you were wondering. So I think we'll start. You all ready? Excellent. So good morning, everybody. My name is Sanjeev Sharma. This is the only slide we have. We're just going to have a conversation. I do have a few pointers which I wrote down, and we chatted a little bit yesterday about what we're going to talk about, but this is going to be an open conversation about DevOps and scaling DevOps in the enterprise. We do have a microphone in the back, so if somebody has a question based on anything somebody says here, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll invite you into the panel discussion. Let's make it as interactive as possible. So let's start off by doing some introductions. My name is Sanjeev Sharma. I work for IBM. This is my old title. I changed roles around a month ago. I'm right now the architecture guild leader for our cloud architecture practice. We work on large, complex, and first-of-a-kind migrations to the cloud in enterprises. But I put up my old title because that has more street cred at this conference. So I'm like, let's stick with that for another month, right? If I put cloud architecture, you wouldn't be paying as much attention, I guess. So let's introduce our esteemed panel here, and we're very fortunate to have Mark, Chris, and Frank here because they have done what we're going to talk about here. So why are in the process of doing it?
We're
right?
in the process.
In the process of doing it, right? So why don't we take a minute each and introduce yourselves, name, and what you do at your company. But I also want you to take a couple of minutes there to talk about why are you on this panel, right? What are you doing? And we'll talk about more detail, but just as an introduction, right? Saying what in your role, why are you at this panel to talk about scaling DevOps at a large enterprise, right? You're either at a large enterprise or you're working with a few of them. So Mark, why don't we start with you?
Sure, Mark Peterson. I've been in this role or this title for a couple of years now, Platform Services Architecture. I have a long history in Wells and other financials, mostly working in the application support and support world or engineering world. I think let's see, the question really of what are we doing? I'll extend my role first. What we're really focused on at Wells is transformation overall, and this isn't just a technology issue, but the bank as a whole is really fundamentally changing how it works in technology and HR and marketing and all of the service parts of the org. We're moving from what has always been run the bank. Did I lose you? There. Run the bank, or run it like you own it attitude in each individual product line to a much more enterprise-first approach towards banking. Certainly, this has a little bit to do with the sales practices issues a couple of years ago, but was even, or that started, were announced a few years ago, but really goes back further than that to the regulatory issues facing banking overall. It's really changed how the bank needs to operate between the regulatory environment, just the business environment, the need to be more efficient overall has really changed how the bank wants to operate. So for me, that's really the role I'm trying to take and be involved in the bank is really how do we make that transformation happen? What do we need to do? It starts, DevOps is certainly a big part of it, really fundamentally changing, standardizing, simplifying, modernizing the architectures and methods we use to approach such a large endeavor. How do you fundamentally do things differently? So that's probably the biggest part of why I'm here is to talk about what that means, how it happens in an enterprise at our scale. Certainly the biggest issues have little to do with the technology. It has everything to do with the organizational and cultural models that have to fundamentally transform and change.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Chris?
Thanks. Does that sound okay? I'm Chris Nowak. I am Chief Transformation Officer at Kingsmen Software. It's a small startup where I run the DevOps advisory practices. We do a lot of different things, software engineering. But that's not really, that's a little better. But that's not really why I'm here. I actually spent 20 years in the banks. I was at Wachovia, Wells Fargo for a while, Bank of America. So I've seen a lot of change. And for about the last 10 years of that while I was there, it was all about creating basically DevOps. 2006 was before DevOps was a word, but it was about automating and scaling what we were doing. So, we started at Wachovia, which was acquired by Wells Fargo in 2008, 9, right? Yep. And it was sort of a startup situation where we didn't have funding. We had a little bit of executive support, and we had to kind of grow it that way, and then kind of gather folks along the way, and make some mistakes. So we had sort of a startup mentality there. When Wachovia was acquired by Wells Fargo, it was how do you cross that barrier to be part of a larger acquisition and be a surviving service? And at B of A, it was this much larger scale. So ultimately at Wells Fargo, we did 350 applications roughly, fully automated, tip to tail. Bank of America topped out around 800. And it was really never, there's a little bit of technology there. We had to rationalize things. We had like 50 different tools, but it was really about the culture, right? So anytime you install a tool, it's not a problem of installing the tool. It's about how do you integrate it with the ecosystem, both procedurally and culturally, right? How do you work with your infrastructure teams? So I would say that probably the biggest reason I'm here is to say it can be done in a highly regulated environment. Mark and I, we actually knew each other from Wells Fargo at the time. It can be done, and it's not easy, or it would have been done already. So to me, that's the next big problem to solve.
Thank you. Frank, can you hear me? Frank Canihuante from Travelers. At Travelers, I work in the tools that actually makes the build and deployment possible. I'm sort of the architect on that. So is this? There we go. How's this? All right, I'll repeat it. Frank Canihuante from Travelers. I work in the tools that do CI and CD, basically. And that's kind of an interesting point of view, because Travelers has been doing some great things in the DevOps space, and they've been doing it for a while. Perhaps going back 10 years, before it was even called DevOps, because there was always a need for someone to do configuration management, infrastructure, builds and deployments. But it got to the point that the practices that everyone wanted to do is, especially in the continuous delivery, continuous deployment space, it was just not possible to do with the tools that the company had, which was an internally based built system to do builds and deploys. So we went through a period that lasted about 3 years where we moved to a new platform that allows us now to do even more things that they've ever done. And we're now at an interesting point because we feel that we can do more. And we are here, and I say we because there's many of us here from Travelers, and we attend all these sessions just to get inspired really, to really say, these are things that can be done because we've done them and we want to do more. It's good to connect with others. It's good to see what others have done. And we also want to say to others, what is it that has worked for us? Many of the things that Mark and Chris talked about has worked for us as well. So that's what I'm here for.
Excellent, thank you. So let's move into, one of the things you all said, and we are seeing this a lot, right? DevOps might be, 5.5 years ago since that famous meetup at Ghent, Belgium, where they coined the term DevOps. I always joke it's the third best thing to come out of Belgium after chocolate and beer. But that's how the term DevOps came about. But in reality, we've all been doing what is today put under this DevOps umbrella for a while, right? And what DevOps and the DevOps movement has done, it given it some kind of organizational structure, some kind of a name. It's not a methodology like Agile, obviously, and I don't think it should be. But at the same time, it has also created a recognition in senior management in large IT organizations that we need to do something, right? But that needing to do something, that desire to do something, translating into actually executing into the kind of transformation you all are talking about, has to have some business driver. There has to be a compelling reason to act, and then we can take that reason and say, this is the business outcome I'm looking for. So maybe we'll start with you, Frank. And was there a compelling reason to act at Travelers which motivated you to make it more formal than that internal grassroots movement which DevOps was before DevOps became DevOps?
Yes, so there was always the need from the grassroots movements, something internal bubbles up from the bottom to the top. But now what we're seeing is that the top is looking down and they're saying, oh, these are great things that people are doing, and it's not necessarily driven from the top down. But that is happening now, and so we're as I was saying before, we're in an interesting inflection point that we can do more if we can meet somewhere in the middle with the business drivers. They're always, better qualities, release more frequently and all that. And what are the things that we need to do, not necessarily tools-wise, but what are the practices, what are the, from the human point of view, what are the collaborations and interactions that we need to have? What types of activities would help us do that? To be honest, one activity that does help us is precisely attending an event like this, where there's greater awareness of the value that there is in DevOps in general.
Is there a particular set of KPIs which you came up with? Because that's something I know, and it's maybe my brain is fine-tuned for it, but because of conversations I've been having with our clients. But that seems to be a theme to say, okay, it's fine to do DevOps, but to what end? What are the measures of success to say, yes, we have improved? And it's not easy. Mark and I were talking about it this morning. It's not easy to identify those in a lot of cases because there is no baseline to measure against. So is that an effort at Travelers to identify certain key metrics, to establish a baseline? Yes. What are the ones? What are the ones which you guys care about?
Yeah, it's interesting that we now have some really lofty goals that we want to meet by 2020. We have a lot of things that we want to do. For example, we want to fully automate things. That's kind of hard to quantify, so we would a percentage. We want, 98% automation. But to your point, there is no good baseline. So that is a challenge in and of itself. However, the thought that you want to do that is a good thing. How do you actually measure it will have actually a greater impact to see if you want to continue with this and be even more successful with some other metrics. Yet another things that we want to do is to, at some point we're going to tackle other environments that are even trickier to measure, such as the cloud. Right now we say we want to deploy n number of applications with a particular success rate, and that also has to be done on different runtimes, but there are different challenges there. A lot of things that need to be figured out. So just some examples of the high-level things that we set to ourselves as to how we're going to measure our progress. But there are many more.
Can we skip to Mark? Chris, I want to ask you the question a bit differently because your perspective is a bit different, right? So Mark, how about you? I know we chatted a little bit today morning, but let's share with the crowd here.
I'll start from a personal point of view about it and then move into more of the Wells Fargo point of view and why we're prioritizing, right? In my view, the reason for the DevOps movement is the amount of technical process debt that has been built up over all previous generations of operational management has grown to the point that it's unsustainable. Meaning, and using Wells, every time there's an incident, a new process is put in place, right? To the point that we have just stacked process on top of process after process, to the point that we can't get a server installed in less than 10 months now, right? So the operational debt that has come up is just completely unsustainable. So I think in many ways, to me, that's really the reason for this transformation that has to occur. And I suspect that's true in many, many places. The given reasons at Wells have moved over the past few years, and I think there's been a bit of history. Certainly a big driver was time to market, trying to improve these unbelievably slow delivery times across the board. But it has shifted. That's still an issue. But general efficiency, cost efficiency has certainly become into play. But it is safety and soundness. How do we start to be, how do we automate to make things more simpler, secure? How do we do patching faster? How do we get ourselves cybersecurity issues? How do we deal with all these issues? That's probably the number one driver that we see this as an answer to at this point.
I think it's very interesting, and I really appreciate your using the term process debt, because we hear people talk about technical debt and code debt, but nobody openly admits to the process debt. And one of the things we do at IBM a lot is we go into large organizations and do value stream mapping exercises, right? Where we look at the process flow end to end for a delivery pipeline or a set of them. And where we find the major bottlenecks and inefficiencies are in the process, right? And even when you have tools, the tools are not being used to their capacity because of that process debt, right? And I think the numbers we found on average are like 65% of your time and money is spent doing process overload in that process overhead, and only 35 is spent actually doing work which results in code getting to production, right? So that 65% is really spend a lot of time.
Exactly what we see.
Yep. So my numbers are good? Yeah. Excellent. So Chris, from your perspective, right, you are looking at it from a wider aperture because you are working with multiple clients. You come from you've been in the industry, but now you're working with clients. Do you see certain patterns and trends of what the business drivers are and KPIs are, and what do you think they should be?
The question is it on now? The question in what you guys just talked about, there's so many things we could pick up on and talk for an hour, but I'm going to add to not just process debt, but we'll talk about culture debt as well. You have to really address all of those things. So I think to that question, right, look at your technical debt, look at your process. These are things that we see as patterns across the board everywhere. And we know that, right? I mean, we talk about DevOps as culture automation, lean process, metrics sharing, all these things. In terms of a metric, well, let me back up. What I've seen is really interesting, whether I'm working with a company that's 50 or B of A is like 180,000, you guys are like 268, something like that. Everywhere in between, they tend to have the same types of challenges. It ultimately goes up towards never retiring your process, right? We always add process, we never prune it. And if you are familiar with the goal, the gold rat, it's all about, you should examine why you're doing something. There was probably a good reason for doing it at one point, but is that relevant today? So take some time and retire that process debt too, which kind of leads into something else, like measuring your cost of delay, which is a Don Reinertson thing. If you read his book, it's great. Your cost of, I guess what he's trying to, or one of the topics in that is, you don't improve the point where you are doing something, you get rid of the delay in between. That's your first win. And think about it, you all know this is true, right? You deliver your code, it sits on the shelf, it's waiting for QA to test, not really QA's fault, right? And it's not anybody's fault, it's the process's fault that has grown up over time. So look for those opportunities to just whack that cost of delay in between. Right? That's common across the board. If I were to pick one measure, I love what Nicole's doing, with Dora and the 4 measures they pick. I think the one thing that I see over and over is if you can just measure, which kind of goes to cost of delay, your speed of deploys. From the time you're checking your code to the time you get to prod, if you're going to do one thing, measure that, right? And then you can lift the cover up and you can say, oh, well, why is my build taking 70% longer? Great, go do a spot treatment on that. You can say, well, why is this deploy taking so long? What do you mean it's going to 4 groups to get approved to go to QA? There's no integrated testing there. Why can't I just do that myself? Get rid of that process. So I think those are just some of the top level types of things you can look for, no matter what size you are.
So you made the perfect segue for my next topic, right? And this is a theme we see over and over again. I've been to several DevOps Enterprise Summits and several other conferences, and of course working with dozens of clients. The cultural inertia which organizations have built, and it's not even homogeneous, right? Because most companies we work with, including IBM, they are not homogeneous. They have different divisions, subdivisions, lines of business. They might have grown through acquisitions and mergers. We never truly integrate culture. So we have different levels of cultural inertia in different organizations. Everybody has a pocket where there is some SWAT team or Skunk Works project going on, which seem to have, they fly under the radar, have no cultural inertia, they have no governance overhead. How do you scale that, right? How do you overcome that cultural inertia? And does it require organizational change? Does it require, bringing in leadership? Is it a grassroots effort? What have you all found as being the most effective mechanism in your organization? What has worked, what has not worked when it comes to overcoming cultural inertia? Why don't we start with you, Frank?
Yeah, so I mean, there may be different things that work, and perhaps different things that work for different folks in different situations. What we have seen that has worked at Travelers, at least in the past 3 years that I've been there, is collaboration. I mean, actually looking at a problem and say, this is our problem. It's a common problem, and we can all kind of solve it together. That, the ownership of the problem by a group of people, and not necessarily one centralized group or a particular line of business, is what gives us that sense of community, that this is a goal that is enterprise-wide. And just to think about it in those terms, it makes you come up with solutions that are more collaborative in nature and far-reaching than something in isolation. And then if you see success with that, you tackle something else and something else after that. And we're at this point now that we start to feel that what we have achieved with this working together can go on to solve other problems. One other problem that we want to solve is that of not necessarily the speed of deployments now, which we feel that is under control perhaps, is the can we release sooner? Do we, right now, many quarters, we release every quarter, but can we release every week or perhaps every day, if it makes sense, and it will not make sense for everyone. So that's what we have seen.
I think it's one of the things you mentioned, that collaboration piece. I think it's that sense of shared ownership, which is a major challenge in a lot of organizations, because we built these artificial silos where it says, hey, my part is done, right? Not my problem anymore. In fact, that's my pitch against creating these overlaid DevOps teams. I go into many organizations, they say, oh, we have a DevOps team over there. The problem is you're just making them responsible for the DevOps piece. You're not taking responsibility yourself. So that shared sense of ownership is very important. My best example of that, where it was done well, I can't name the company, but they had made these t-shirts with everybody is responsible for action. And they gave that t-shirt to everybody. They even gave it to the coffee machine repair guy. And the idea was that the coffee machine is broken and people have to walk to the latte shop, you delayed production by 20 minutes. So everybody is responsible, right? So I think that's the sense of shared ownership. Anything you'd like to add to that, Chris?
It's going to be different for everybody in every organization. Sorry.
We're fading in and out. This is kind of the twilight zone here.
It's going to be different for every organization, right? But at the higher level, it kind of is the same. You have to identify that place where you can share that success outcome. Sometimes you're going to be doing it at grassroots. I've had to do it only at grassroots until the executive thought he could trust us enough to give us money to do it the right way. In other places, we've actually had the executive support with it, which was great, but it comes with a whole nother set of challenges as well. So I think you just have to figure out where it is. But the overriding point is find a place where you can do what you need to do with people that are willing to do it with you, right? So Arthur Ashe has a quote, to be great, do what you can with what you have where you are, right? And that's going to be for every one of you guys. So find that group you can do it with, show some success, put some points on the board early. It has to be continuous. You cannot wait 9 months to do it. And then all those folks that were maybe a little hesitant to do it, they're like, it is working. Nobody's jumping down their throats for doing it. They're being innovative. They're being adaptive. And it kind of creates this excitement. And as leaders, I'm assuming everybody here has some role in there, whether you have a team or you're doing it individually. It is your job to inspire, right? And by doing that, you do.
And we talked about earlier this morning, Mark, when we were chatting, that in your organization you wanted to get some quick wins, so you went with tools first, and now are tackling the organizational challenges. Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. First, if anyone has any magic answers to this question out there, please tell us. So we did start with tools first, and really just agreeing that we're going to have an enterprise standard around tools, that we are going to drive an enterprise solution aimed at those tools and move all teams towards them. Chris, as he pointed out, there was, when he was there was 350 apps put on one of what I'd call the pocket tool chains in the bank. There were a few at the time. And those pocket teams in different line of businesses are now being put together, not organizationally yet, well, even organizationally they're starting to be, but really we started with, let's get them all together. Let's get the people that are experts in this space together to work on an enterprise solution. It turned out that probably the two or three best, or two or three groups came up with basically the same solutions separately within the bank. So it was pretty easy to get agreement on what solution we were going to go towards overall. And now they're really taking their ideas, sharing them, building across for this overall enterprise goal, and onboarding all the rest of the apps in the bank. So just to give an idea of those numbers, so when Chris was there, it was 350 just in one major business. It's probably around 500 at that point. It's probably now, we've probably onboarded across the bank about 1,200 to 1,500 apps, and we're aiming for 6,000 onto the solution. So it has been an effort to really start almost grassroots, but we had the buy-in at the very senior levels that we are doing this as an enterprise solution, that it's gonna be a pure centralized method with a federated approach towards those groups, towards the lines of business to get to support them as a real service. Just like if you can go out and buy it on Amazon, why can't you buy it internally as a service? So we've really been driving that idea for the culture with that executive support, and then making sure we had the right people across all the different groups to contribute, to be part of it, to build the solution together.
You mind if I?
Please, no, the less I'd say, the better.
Actually, so I agree with everything you said, and it kind of took me a while, unbelievably long, to come to the realization that I didn't own a DevOps team, right? I owned a platform services team that provided DevOps services. And literally, I figured that out about 6 months ago after doing this for years. The DevOps teams are what Sanjeev was referencing earlier. They are the teams, the application, not just application, but the teams that are coming together, your security, your QA, your dev, your ops, all those folks that are getting together, architecture, audit even, right? And if you're really good at it, you're pulling in finance and HR. Those are the folks that are saying, how do we deliver this thing to the business? I actually had, and you do, I guess, right? We have the DevOps support services teams. It took me a long time. Well, we operate like a DevOps team on our own, but we're not the DevOps team. So I actually think that distinction is important to make, just to kind of keep things clear about who's doing what and who provides what to who.
I think it's a very good point. Even at IBM, which is very large, highly distributed development teams, we have what we call a DevOps Center of Excellence. They own the platform. They have a platform, they maintain the platform. They also provide DevOps coaches. So if a product line comes and says, hey, I want to start using DevOps to deliver something massive like WebSphere application server, they onboard it to that platform. They hire DevOps coaches from their center of excellence who comes in and then helps them make that transition, almost like an advisory service. Right. And then their job is to work themselves out of a job so that team can become self-sufficient to do continuous delivery, right? We have DevOps on the mainframe. You already heard a few speakers talk about that, because that platform is truly very broad, and it's not one platform for the entire organization. But I want to make a quick comment on something you said. You said 1,200 applications?
Roughly right
Roughly
now,
all that. How about you at Travelers? How many do you?
Now about 3,000 apps.
Right. But I have to say this, right? I love it. I go into large organizations, and they'll come to me and say, Sanjeev, we don't need your enterprise DevOps playbook approach. We went to Silicon Valley, we talked to some startups, we're going to do what they do. And I always ask them, how many apps does that startup have? 2? I think Uber has 3 apps, right? Anybody from Uber here, can they confirm that, right? How many apps do they have, right? A large startup will probably have 5 apps. We are nowhere near the 5,000. You can't do what a small startup, which is co-located in one building on one floor, right, which has the architectural, no technical debt, no cultural debt, no architectural debt. Yeah. You can't take lessons from them and apply it to, there are good lessons to take from them, don't get me wrong. We all want that nirvana. But unless you can start with a blank slate, you have to do what they did. You have to do what we did. You have to start from where you are and start eliminating that debt over time.
And those applications are interdependent too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not like you can just deploy this all day and it affects nothing, right?
In fact, the business doesn't care if one app gets deployed. They care, can I deliver this business function? Can I process that claim? Can I process this loan? If my service works and something else doesn't.
It's even worse than that. The apps are not, there's no consistency in the app definitions. right? So what is an app in one group is a completely different thing in another. You'll have an app that really consists of 100 different applications in many ways.
Exactly, and
Question.
yeah, we have a question, right? So let's take that question while Mike is making its way there. The whole conversation we have about what's a service, what's a microservice. That conversation itself can be a whole day-long panel. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is a challenge to what you said, but I'd like to hear you speak to what we heard from Capital One. You have to do this. It sounds a lot like top down, and I don't mean to be insulting. I'm not trying to, this is a good thing to talk about. It sounds to me like what specifically Wells Fargo you're talking about is a top down, here's a platform, we're gonna march everybody to it. Okay, so, but Capital One seems to have found a way to say, small teams, we're gonna have the startup culture, and we're going to do it that way. So maybe that's what you're doing. So
right. So I don't want to say, as I said, it's not like you cannot get lessons from the startups, but you have to figure out what works amongst them and how to apply it to you based on where you're starting from. Let's take something, for example. At IBM, we've implemented the Spotify squad tribe guild model. Our application of it doesn't look the way Spotify did it. We got good ideas from it on how to organize our teams and have that shared ownership by having squads, tribes, and guilds. In fact, I told you my new title is Cloud Architecture Guild Leader. I have it in my official title. But ours is different because we are several hundred times, maybe a few thousand times bigger than Spotify. They're a great company. We learned a lot from them. Also, we're geographically distributed over every continent except Antarctica. I can tell you, I've been to every continent except Antarctica to visit IBM customers, right? So you have to learn from that. And yes, I don't think anybody here is saying we are doing top-down only. We are saying don't ignore the top-down. Everybody's doing the bottom-up. DevOps always starts as a grassroots effort by people saying, this doesn't work. Let me pick up the phone and find out who this other guy is I'm supposed to work with. They do it in an ad hoc way. What we are saying is make it an enterprise-wide effort and standardize it. So people are not doing it in an ad hoc way, and you're not dependent upon who you know. Most places, the way things get deployed and done are based on who you know, and you building your own culture. I remember when I was a developer, I used to go buy donuts for the ops guys, so they would take care of me first. Please.
Standardize, not to centralize. Some people think of it as centralization is a good thing. You own the tools, you own the processes, but it's not about centralizing, which has a negative connotation. You're taking power away from me. It's about standardizing. That's what allows you to scale, standardizing on the tools, on the processes, even this knowledge and the understanding of certain practices. We're actually working on that precisely, trying to come up with standard definitions of what CI is and particular types of tasks within CI. And that allows you to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think it's what I left out in that description is probably 10 years of teams individually at the ground level creating solutions. The problem with that has been there's no way to get it to be consistent, to be standard across the bank. You need that top-down level decision to say, yes, we want to do this type of process across the whole bank and really get buy-in to help deliver that. Otherwise, you end up with every group building its own solution, which is essentially what's happened over time, right? And you end up with a product selection that literally, I mean, I can go to every single vendor and they all have, something here at Wells Fargo. They're in, right? And to manage that is not efficient at the enterprise scale, right? So we're trying to become more efficient, which is not to say that it's a top-down decision then or approach. We're really trying to build the expertise at the platform level as a group that's going to say, here's the way to build this for the bank as a service. And I did come back to that idea of building this as a service. We were talking last night a little bit about the cloud, and I hate the word cloud at this point because it's not, when you just say cloud, everyone umbrellas everything into it. when what's really needed in a place like the bank is a bunch of services. These are the services that are going to be delivered in a cloud type way, right? And it doesn't matter what the middleware is or what the component is, but it needs to be delivered as a service to the entire enterprise. DevOps is in many ways the same thing. It's a service that needs to be offered as a utility. It has to be done as a group, and it has to be done with the right level of expertise in the teams. And to do that, you need that top level buy-in that it's going to happen. The Cap One example, I think, is a terrific example. I mean, there's many great things that they've done. It's in a place, Wells is larger, right? And it has a whole different set of issues to deal with. We often go back and forth on, should we just do a greenfield approach? Should we do how should we handle this differently that would be, a better way? We try to learn lessons from places like Cap One and others, and we do, but it's really a finding our way to do it.
Absolutely, because everybody's different. The starting point is different. Also, within the organization, you're different, right? But the way I see it, to kind of expand upon what you said, is the goal of the standardization, what you said, Frank, is to really put some guardrails around what you let people at the grassroots do and not do, so that there's no chaos. But at the same time, those guardrails will need to be very selective about what you want to standardize on and what you do not. You don't want to standardize on a programming language. You don't want to standardize on a build tool. Those are commoditized, right? It's a service. But you do want to standardize on certain areas like operational readiness, deployment automation, configuration management, and you might have more than one standard because you'll have a mainframe. I'm sure you all do, right? But on the same side, you have mobile apps also. You should have different standards for them. Chris?
Yeah, and I know there's a couple questions. I'll try to make it quick. I was going to say I was going to take a contrarian point of view, but I think you started to pick up on it. I'm starting to believe there's a limit to where you do centralize, but it depends on what you're doing, right? So you might do some of these things and standardize it and centralize it, but I think people never really look at the cost. So you have a tool conversation, and it stops at licensing. And that's the tip of the iceberg. What they're not looking at is what are your second and third order effects, the cost of delay, all of those other things. How long are you making the business wait? And if you're not thinking about that, which most people don't, then you have a tool war conversation and it means nothing. Standardizing that at the top level is fairly myopic in my opinion, because what you're doing at that point is not looking at all of that downstream cost that ultimately affects the business, which is really what you should be aligning on in the first place. So optimize for business value and take it to the right level. And I do think that as you go up every level, right, you start at a team and then the division and then the enterprise, you keep hitting these cultural barriers. And every group of folks, really it's going to be once you unlock the culture to allow the right types of choices around standardization, then that's where you can really start to excel past the folks that you're competing with.
I'll add one more to that, which is, and this may sound contradictory to some of the other things I've said, but what I'm recognizing is decomposing. A lot of times people just kind of put everything ends up meshing in the SDLC process, right? Your SDLC policy becomes policy, process, procedures, standards, all comprised in one kind of document. I've started to really try to decompose those aspects of it. So there's principles, control points, policy, and process and procedures and tools. So that you can have ultimately the conversation of letting the right teams choose at the ground level the process and procedures and tools while still having control points that are key to the organization as a whole and an enterprise as a whole. Right?
You have a question over here.
It's a quick one. Thanks for sharing these experiences. I'm really interested in your perspective on speeding up some of the rates of adoption. So I kind of want to double click a little bit on the standardization part, and in particular around vocabulary. So I come into a lot of different organizations, and when you have small scale conversations, meeting rooms, let's say under 10 people, people are talking about entirely different things, even though the words are the same. Like you mentioned, platform or services.
Cloud.
Define an application for me.
Yeah. So at a small scale, you can get that team to start aligning on the meaning and to kind of have a vocabulary that's pretty consistent. But you guys have introduced, with DevOps in general, there's a lot of new words that are brought together or terms. how important is it to standardize the vocabulary when you meet with the broader teams or the bigger groups in their domains? When you bring up something, how do they respond? And I guess the question is, how important is it to standardize vocabulary and broaden that?
So I think, I'm glad you asked it, because I think that's really important, and I think I forget about it, and a lot of us do. If you're not speaking the same language on what you mean, you're going to have conflicts for the rest of the year. So absolutely, what does it mean to be a build engineer? What does build mean, right? To me, build is not an artifact set. Build is the process of creating something that can be deployed in a run state. And I usually actually start that. I'm like, build means something different to us. Let me tell you what it means. So you have to do that, or else your teams aren't communicating. You might as well speak different languages.
Same here. Even words that are overloaded, like pipeline. And people think that as is it a set of tools, big and small? Is it a set of processes? Or is it a particular thing like a Jenkins pipeline plugin? To your point, I mean, if you don't have a standard language that gives you a common understanding, it's just hard to do. And you're going to constantly run into issues of thinking about the same thing but looking at it differently, or looking at different things and saying it differently. It's just not going to work.
I can. So one of the things we do when we go in and start a DevOps transformation engagement is we say, let's set up a DevOps center of excellence, center of competency, whatever you want to call it, right? So at a large bank where I worked with, we did that with a Friday afternoon lunch and learn every week. The first lunch and learn, it was 6 people, right? And I was the speaker as an outsider. Today, they have over 200 people, 300 people on a web conference every Friday. The idea is kind of a watering hole, where people can meet, share their experiences, and then through that, start harvesting, okay, this is our definition of what does to say we are fully deployed or fully automated in deployment. This is our definition of a release. This is our definition of a build. If we are going to use containers, we are going to do X with containers, right? Everything is a Helm chart. Whatever the standardization you want. So these guys are deciding on the nouns and verbs of your taxonomy. It's very important, but it's done as a group. You cannot mandate that. But you also ensure that it's standard. Otherwise, people like us vendors will come and confuse the heck out of you, because what I call something is very different from what the CA guys or the pivotal guys will call it. We have our own definitions, trust me. Within our company, we have different definitions.
First thing I do when I go to a company is I say, what is DevOps going to mean to you? Right, because we don't have a definition of DevOps. I think we all agree it's around culture, and that's probably where the conversation ends, right? So we do that. We have a lean agile practice. The first thing, our person will do is she'll say, what is the definition of done for you? So do that.
Right. And is done deployed to production, or is it done a user using it? There's very two different definitions. Yes, sir.
Can you guys talk about how you decide which one of your applications that you're going to move into the pipeline, the DevOps process first? Speaking from large organizations that have core business and then not core business. So clearly core business gets done first, but how do you, I guess, balance the cost of automated testing and getting that into the pipeline versus the benefits?
I can start on that one. So we've bounced around on that a little bit. I'd say our main approach is from a risk lens, right? And especially around vulnerability patching and how to fundamentally get the environment cleaner. So any apps, we have a whole ranking system for all of our apps. And we call it the critical application model, something or other, CAMs. So every app gets a ranking. It's a critical, high, medium. And we've just been going on that ranking as far as moving them onto the tool chain for the most part. Where it gets interesting is we're shifting that a little bit now because the model and straight out due to struts, due to Equifax, due to those issues, beyond just the tool chain in DevOps, we're really taking a greater focus on our publicly accessible apps, and we're moving them up into the list, and not just the tool chain stuff, but doing more work around how we want to manage those as a platform going forward.
So let me pitch my book. You all got a copy coming in, right? So in my book, I describe a model which we have been developing at IBM, which is along those lines, looking at risk versus value. There are certain applications which are very high value to your business and have very low risk tolerance. And at the other end, there are things where you have very high risk tolerance, but the value is very low. You start off with where you can show quick wins, but minimize the risk. So that way you can create a spectrum, just like you did with your rankings, not very dissimilar. I think you have to go look at it that way. And there's twofold. One, you want to show long-term business value, so that'll come with the high value ones, but those are the ones usually attached to the low risk tolerance. You want to start with quick wins to start building that momentum. Getting those quick wins is very important. When I was talking about that COE example, the biggest win was the third meetup we had, the third Friday, where one company came and said, hey, we used Urban Code Deploy, and what used to take us 2 days to deploy, we can do it in 20 minutes now. That just, people went, whoa, what did you do, right? So creating that quick wins is essential to create the momentum and overcome those barriers.
Cannot overstate that enough. If you don't have quick wins, funding runs out in 9 months and you're going to be doing something else. But so we took the same approach, sort of. We would look at the entire application portfolio, and then we would take an easy one first. Let's just figure out if we really understand what we're dealing with. Because I've lifted the cover on an application and found 40 underneath, right? It's not easy. So do one first, but also what you get from that is a learn, right? And you get a relationship with the application team. So I'll look for a team that's willing to play ball, and then say, let's do 3 apps. Let's do an easy one so we make sure we understand the technology we're dealing with. Let's do a medium one. And then if we feel comfortable with the risk ratio, let's go after the hardest one. Because if I can do that, I can do the rest of your portfolio, and let's line it up. But it's going to be different for every situation.
I think it also matters what technologies you're using, because large companies, you may have mainframe, desktop, mobile, regular Linux and Windows applications. And if you already have some patterns that take advantage of some automated tools to do the task, so it's really not that much more to bring in yet another app, no matter what its value to the business is, and just add it to the pipeline as a fully tested app.
Right.
If it's already there.
Pattern and roll.
If some app which really fits your risk value criteria, but it's a total outlier in the technology stack, obviously don't do it first. Because it's not going to add no value. You cannot learn anything from it and apply it to others. And we go in and see, there'll be an ERP app or a packaged application, very critical to the business, but it's one of a kind in that company. There's no reason to do that first, because you cannot apply what you learned to other applications. So common pattern is also very important. Good point.
Plus, just about every large company will have different business units or lines of business, and for each one of them, they'll have their own favorite tools or applications rather that they think that these are the highest value apps that need to go and be fully integrated into the pipeline, no matter what the technology is.
We have a question.
So just a quick question on how you go through coming up with a taxonomy and some of the principles while making sure you're not crushing the culture you're trying to create, especially as open source is challenging some of the way we traditionally thought about allowing software development to happen, right? Because now there's incredible switching costs that come along with altering a pipeline. And so how do we make sure that we don't get ourselves in a situation where a year from now we're spending a ton of money because we're not thinking about what it's going to cost to actually alter that pipeline?
We talked about it this morning.
We did. That's not a quick question. I'll answer the first part of it. Yeah, the first part of it is to altering the pipeline. That to me is sort of a founding principle of how we want to manage the pipeline, is that we do this in a way that we can switch in and out tools. If not, I mean, the history has always been, yeah, once you put in a tool like this, it's there forever, right? We are very much trying to be of the attitude and opinion that we will be agile with our tool chain, right? And be nimble and be ready to swap it out if we find the approach isn't working or a better solution has come along. So I think that answers the first part of your question. open source in general has many other facets of interest. But yeah.
So I think the catch to that pipeline question is when you bring in a new tool, think in a lean style of thinking, right? The lean startup way that I'm building an MVP with the tool, right? I need to be able to experiment with it to see if it fits my company. So run some POCs, run some pilots to see if it's a fit. But at the same time, you have to work, and it's odd coming from a vendor, you have to work towards lowering the cost of adoption of the tool so that you can lower the cost of replacing it, right? So if I'm giving my child a bicycle, eventually, I want them to graduate to a car, but you have to start with the bicycle first. I can't put my 10-year-old in a car. They won't let me, right? So you have to say, okay, today I can develop this set of tools, but once my organization matures, I can look at Kubernetes, right? I can look at doing containerizing everything, but I cannot do it today because I'm not ready for it. I'm still on a bicycle with training wheels, right? So I think if you keep that long-term planning in mind, and that's something where we can come and help you create that 18-month, 5-year, 10-year roadmap. And then there are the unknowns, 2 years ago, nobody talked about Kubernetes.
Yeah, and I'll add to that point, I think there's one more aspect that I didn't really talk about, which is part of it is an organizational and a real cultural shift. And what we had not previously done well or invested in enough is core engineering skills, right? And so to do what I just described, to be agile in the tool chain, you really need that core engineering team capability that is strong and ready to do that. And I think that's an area where we're certainly investing.
So Frank, this is your company, so you want to comment?
I actually agree with what we're saying. So we think of the tool chain, and I like to think of the enterprise tool chain because there are hundreds of tools that travelers like sizes, companies of that size will use, but there's only a handful that really make up the backbone. There you got your SCM, you have your CI, and you have your CD, and perhaps within CD you have a deploy and a release type of tools, and perhaps a ticket and a binary repository. And those are the main tools. And those are the ones that you like to keep as a system. They're really a system of systems. And understanding one tool does not give you an understanding of the whole system. So, and that you try to maintain, you try to grow together. And if you make one change here, you need to keep an eye on whether or not it will affect some other piece. And you integrate them, and you like to keep them loosely connected or loosely integrated. And as Mark was saying, I'm always thinking, in fact, if this tool will go away, what would I have to do to the rest of the pipeline to keep the whole thing still intact? So that is a different way of looking at tools. At Travelers, we're starting to think of it as a system. Systems think in like lean. And it will grow as a system, not as individual tools. It's a different way to look at it.
And I've always looked at it, I'll be real quick about it. I've always looked at it like a framework, even from way back when. I've got a Visio on it. And we always said we wanted to be, in fact, this was our phrase, a pluggable, swappable framework. And this was like back in 2002, we were talking this way. And it was exactly for the reasons we talked about. We knew it wouldn't last forever. So think of it that way. And let's be real about it. Nothing's free. Open source isn't free either, right? There's always a cost, right? Because I actually had a situation where I was called up and it was a Jenkins plugin and they said, my Star Team plugin doesn't work anymore. I go, well, I don't know anything about your Star Team plugin. Well, the guy in Sweden stopped developing it. I'm sorry, I can't support that. So nothing is really free. It's just always a trade. But understand what your trades are is maybe the bigger thing to do. The other thing that I'm kind of thinking about lately is SDLC, we always express it linearly. It's not, right? I actually see deploy as the center of the universe because everything radiates out from deploy. To me, it seems to be a hub spoke. I can change work item tracking tools all day long, and with a little bit of configuration, it's going to flow into my deploy and catch all the data. Build tool, you can still kind of swap it in and out. Artifact management, same thing. You get to deploy though, and it radiates out to everything you touch, your orchestration, your provisioning. And so there are higher costs with certain things that you want to put more thought into up front. And to me, the deploy process is, at least today, I think that's really what you want to pay attention to. It's hardest to change.
Yep. So if you want to learn more about Urban Code Deploy, you can come to the IBM booth and learn all about it. Question over there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back just for a moment, back to the standardization conversation, and I'm curious to hear your insights on how you balance individual DevOps teams, you know, the two pizza team type thing, their autonomy when it comes to things like architecture and those standardizations, and the balance between, you know, an overarching architecture team or centralized ownership of architecture versus, you know, empowering those individual teams. I'm curious to understand your guys' perspective on that.
Many times that argument, centralized versus decentralized. If you have a large organization, there'll be, like I said, multiple lines of business or business units, and they will have their own architecture, their own DevOps teams, perhaps. And it's hard to say to everyone, this is the only tool, this is the only process, this is the only way to do things. It kind of kills the whole idea of, you know, having a little freedom and creativity and all of that. But led to their own devices, everybody will go their own ways, and you start to lose enterprise value. So once in a while, at least it's good to meet and say, which direction are you going with your tools and your processes? And does it make sense to continue in that direction? You know, this is where it helps with come to events like this to kind of see where everybody else is going, whether or not it makes sense for us to kind of go in this direction. Or out of the 3 or 5 different ways that people are going internally, maybe 1 or 2 of those are the way to go, and not all 5.
So we're wrapping up right now, so let me see if we can take 1 or 2 more questions. There's one over here. How many more do we have? Yeah, any other questions? Let's queue them up so we can quickly take a few, because we have 3 minutes left. Shout it out, sir, I'll repeat it. Oh, that's a tough one. So here's the challenge, right, with our heavily outsourced is, and I've been in many situations, I work for an outsourcer, which has outsourcer, is that when the contracts and the lawyers come out, all things go to hell. So if you can get around that, right, and right at the beginning, give guidance to your outsourcer how you want them to engage with the DevOps lifecycle, things will work better. It's when you're injecting it midstream a contract, that's when they say, okay, let's go to page 739 and see how change management happens, right? That's when we run into trouble. But I'm sure you guys have your own perspectives. Frank?
I think it's kind of a necessary evil that you have to deal with. I think at the end, you do want to control the direction where you want to be taking the enterprise. And they're there to help you, and in some cases to work with you and collaborate. But I think you have to have the vision of where you want to have them work on, and you know what tools and practices you want to have them do.
And I think it's that whole point that next time you sign a new contract or the contract is up for renewal, the standardizations you have done in terms of process, if you started that DevOps journey, they are engaged and aware. I remember doing one of my DevOps value stream mapping workshops, and they kept saying, no, that's the responsibility of the outsourcer. 2 hours into the workshop, I said, time out, we're stopping this right here. Let's reconvene next week, bring the outsourcer in the room, because I cannot do this. How can I do a value stream mapping where there's one big black box in the middle, which you have no control or visibility into? So we have one more question. Let's take that, and then we'll call it a day. And there are 2 people with questions right next to each other. So same question, good. Okay.
Thanks. Chris, I was really happy to hear you say that a leader's job is to inspire. I think the other part of that job feels like it's coaching and developing. So as you think about the cultural elements of what you're doing with DevOps, what are you doing to ensure that your leaders are prepared to coach, develop, and inspire?
1 minute? All right, so, wow. It's your responsibility as a leader to train them to take your job. Okay? Make sure they're there. Give them the clarity, and I'm quoting from a book that Turn the Ship Around has been mentioned a few times here. Give them clarity, which means you have to provide the why as to what they're doing. Give them the guardrails and get out of the way, right? And then make sure they're competent to do it. So that's a cycle. You keep training them up more and more. To Mark's point about you need to continue to grow your engineering disciplines, right? And at some point, step out of the way and let them go. Now somebody else is the leader. Right? I don't know how else to express it in literally 1 minute, but coach them, train them, and get out of the way.
I'll add one thought to that, which is, I think when you're trying to do transformation at this scale and at this level of change for an organization, it's constant reminders of the very fact that you are trying to transform, that you are trying to get really in what the goal is, right? To remind people constantly that you're undergoing a complete change in how the institution operates. And what that ultimate goal is, really try to be clear about where you're ultimately going, and constantly reminding people, because it's so easy for teams to fall back into prior patterns and think and be limited by what they've done, just limit themselves, right? People are constantly limiting themselves. So I'm always trying to remind people what we're after in the end, right?
Yep. And you have to support their decisions, right? Let them know it's okay. Because if they do something and they get their
Right.
wrist slapped, they're not going to do it again.
Yeah.
So before we wrap it up, I need to make an announcement. If you the conversation and would like to continue it, IBM is hosting a reception today evening. So if you see Mary in the back, Mary is there in the blue t-shirt waving. She has some registration cards. We have very limited seats, but if you'd love to continue this conversation, we'd love to have you there. So please see Mary and get the registration form. With that, I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists. This was a great conversation. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks.